Welcome to Wellness Today. I'm your host, Tracey Gonzalez, a licensed clinical social worker in the greater Danbury area, and I'm excited about today's show. We're coming to you each week to discuss everything about wellness. We're going to discuss nutrition, we're going to discuss your physical needs, your emotional needs. We're just going to have a good time on our show, informing you of what you need to be well and whole, to basically fulfill your destiny in life. And today we have a really good show planned. I have a special guest today with me, someone who has been my friend and colleague for over 10 years. Today we're going to be talking about the challenges of parenting with my friend. Please welcome Dennis Bieber. Hi, Dennis.
Hi, Tracey. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad that you're here. This is going to be fun. We've worked together for a long time, and now I can kind of like pull on your expertise, because parenting can be very stressful, yet rewarding. We have challenges, and that's what we're here to talk about today, the challenges of parenting. So I'll let you begin, and I'm going to jump in from time to time. I can't keep quiet.
Absolutely. So, the challenges of parenting, all explained easily step by step in the guide to parenting that I'm still looking for.
Aren't we all?
What can I say? Different needs, different circumstances, different experiences, different parenting styles. You got to take into account, culture, family beliefs, cultural beliefs, religious beliefs. All these things kind of form who we are as parents.
Right. And you've been working with families for a long time, right?
Yeah, I've been working with families for probably 15 years,
15 years.
In different capacities. And in a lot of the interventions, I've noticed that parents struggle a great deal. In my own personal experience, I oftentimes will try to reflect on my own advice and find myself in certain situations, and I'm like, whoa, practice what you preach.
Right.
But when you're actually in the trenches, when you're in the moment dealing with the situation, it's a completely different animal.
Yeah.
It's a completely different animal.
Yeah. And so, in the years that you've been working with families, parents, children, families, uncles, aunts, grandparents, let's hone in on a certain area, to help out our viewers here. What's one of those areas that are of particular interest to you and that you've had pretty much a lot of experience with?
I think, parenting kids with special needs, whether it's emotional or behavioral or physical or developmental, really providing support to the parent or the caregiver so that they can be at their best in meeting the needs of that child.
Right. And you say caregiver because, when we think of parenting, we think of mom and dad, biological mother and father, but there are other caregivers as well that you work with.
Foster parents, adoptive parents, grandparents,
right.
Aunts and uncles. On occasion, brother or sister might be appointed guardian, depending on their ages and being older and such.
And when we think about our children, when we think about the children that we are raising, that we're taking care of, that we're caregiving, if we were to look at a 5-year-old, a 9-year-old, just going through the gambit of the developmental stages, what are some of the challenges that parents face? Maybe even starting as an infant. What are some of the challenges that you could help our viewers out with today?
I think just, learning your child or children. Oftentimes, I'll work with parents who will say, well, this works with one, but it doesn't work with the other. It's really, learning the nuances of what works well for each kid and what works well for your child. And not to always depend on that one particular way of doing things. Sometimes you need to have multiple tools in your toolbox that you can pull out at any given point in time. Should one not be working in the moment, you have something else to fall back on. But it's not easy. The other thing I think that I always encourage parents to do is to try and be in touch and be aware of how they're feeling emotionally. So as parents, I think it's easy to get frustrated. It's, easy to bring home with you maybe some stresses that occurred at work, or maybe there are some financial stresses, or there's emotional stresses in terms of relationships. Maybe, you've got mom and dad having some marital difficulties or relationship difficulties. And, you've got then kids coming in with their needs, trying to get their needs met. And as parents, maybe our fuse is a little bit short that day.
Right.
Which then can actually trigger the kids to respond in kind.
Right.
In my experience, I've noticed that most kids are able to regulate their emotions based on how their parents or caregivers are doing.
That's good. That's a very good point. I'm thinking about, let's hold that point there, because that's a good one. I want to focus in on that. We were talking about children with special needs. And do you have any examples, or really examples that you can give, where you may have a child with a special need, no matter what the age, and they have other siblings, and you have parents who are doing the normal thing, working, mom and dad may be working. What are some of the challenges that are faced in that situation, and what's some tips that you can give parents when they're dealing with we may have a child that is doing fine, that they're in regular educational classes, but then we may have a child that has a diagnosis, or maybe there's some developmental delays, and that child may need a little bit more attention than the other. What are some of the challenges that parents face, whether it's a couple or a single parent?
I think, in my experience, the challenges are, how do you, allocate time for each child? It's important that each child feels as if they have, that sort of one-on-one attention, that alone time, that, time to connect. Those are all super important things.
Yes.
However, it's easier said than done to expect that one child's needs are going to supersede the others. Right. You're talking about subjective interpretation based on the child. They're getting more attention than I am. No, which then potentially leads to child conflict as well.
Yep.
I think the one thing I would encourage parents to do is to be mindful of transition times. Transition times are the times when I think kids struggle the most. So that's bedtime routines, wake up routines, getting to and from school, to be as predictable, consistent, routined, structured as possible, in order to really create that physical and emotional safety, so that if something does happen, there's sort of the routine that does help control the outcome a little bit.
Right. Can you give an example of give our viewers an example of a routine? Let's just say, many times we do speak to parents where by the time it's dinner time and homework time and bedtime, some children are like really riled up. They're not ready to go to sleep. It's very hard for them to kind of simmer down. Or that time of evening could be very chaotic for some families. What are some tips that you give, whether it's a couple or single parents, to help them to provide that structure and that routine that's needed? Because we know that kids do thrive on structure and routine, even though they'll kick against it,
I would say, bedtime, I think is consistently one of those times that's very difficult. And it's easy for parents and caregivers to sort of deviate. Maybe, dinner was started late. Maybe, they got home from work late, and the routine kind of gets interrupted. But I think around bedtime in particular, it's important, whether you're starting with brushing teeth, getting pajamas on, there might be reading time, there might be kind of together time, sort of as a ritual to help calm and regulate the child's emotions so that they sleep well. To try and be as consistent with that as possible. I think the folks that struggle the most are the ones that don't have any particular routine. It's like, geez, it's 9 o'clock. It's time to go to bed. It's time to go to bed. And there's no transitioning. There's no sort of guiding and leading the children through a ritual that helps to provide that that calmness.
You know, I have a question for you. You just brought something to my attention, and this is in regards to structure and routine, okay? Many times we work with families where we actually put together a structure chart to help the family maintain that routine, help mom or dad keep their sanity, you know, help the child stay on task. What would you say to the parent? And I'll say, well, you know, I was going to say moms, but it's moms and dads, where there is this structure chart, there is this schedule in place. The child does pretty good in adhering to it, but the parent has difficulty adhering to it. We can talk to parents and they'll say, well, you know, Sammy is making his bed when he's supposed to. He's washing the dishes every other day. He's getting his homework done. But he started to kind of like slack off a little bit. And I think it's my fault. It's just so hard for me to keep track of this schedule. But as we're listening to the parent, it sounds like little Sammy is doing well. He's thriving with this structure in place. What do you say to the moms or even the dads that say, I don't know if I can keep this up. How can this benefit me?
Well, I try to lead them through the process of recognizing and understanding what the impact is on the child, and that helping them to understand that that little bit of work in the now will reap greater benefits later on, because then it becomes part of that routine. I think the idea of a behavior plan or a time chart plan, whatever you want to call it, isn't that this is going to become the definitive family routine forever.
Right.
I think the idea is that it kind of is more of a jump start into getting the family on a more productive track.
Right.
You know, frankly, behavior plans that are long-term, I've rarely ever seen them work.
Okay.
And it's just because it takes so much effort and dedication to make sure that it happens on a regular basis, that it does take away from other opportunities to connect with the family and the child.
Yes.
And so I think the idea is that once they get into a routine that's a little bit more productive and more predictable, and yeah, is it going to be perfect all the time? No, things do happen.
Right.
But the more we can be there, the more we are able to connect with our children, the more as adults we're able to help our children to regulate their emotions by being regulated ourselves, the better the outcomes.
That's good. And you know, I know that you have a private practice and you see a lot of children, you talk to a lot of different families. One of the things that I would like you to talk about a little about is the school piece, especially when we're dealing with children with special needs. You have a mother that calls up and she says something like, you know, I'm looking for a therapist for my child. He's been diagnosed with ADHD in the past, or maybe some type of disruptive disorder or something. What would you tell this parent? How would you guide this parent in working with the school to be able to help this child flourish and to help this child stick to routines and schedules?
You know, oftentimes, depending on what the needs of that child and family are, I may connect them to an educational advocate.
Okay.
Somebody who's more well-versed in, you know, sort of the special ed laws and what sort of, you know, different things can be employed by the school that are going to best meet the needs of the kids. What I try to do in those situations is to support the parent in particular, because oftentimes their stress levels starting to creep up, which in turn can affect the child's ability to regulate their emotions and to do well, but to really help to guide them along through the process, as opposed to trying to do it all myself. I think, you know, sometimes it's important to recognize that there are other people that are available who are experts in a particular discipline that will be better serve the child and the family.
So it sounds like in addition to you working with the child, that you're creating a support system for that parent. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of the times, I mean, one of the biggest indicators of how well kids are going to do is how stressed out their parents are.
Yeah.
And it sounds very simple, but the more stressed we are as parents, our kids are impacted by that.
Yeah.
And if we can help to reduce the parents' level of stress to a more reasonable, manageable level, the outcomes are better for the kids.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. What about co-parenting? Co-parenting.
Oh man, that is just constantly one of those topics that is a forever revolving door of potential conflict.
And we could be talking about co-parenting with a mom and dad that are together in the home. But many times we're talking about co-parenting a mom and dad that's either separated or divorced, or there's a blended family involved. What are some of the challenges that you see, and what are some of the successes that you've experienced in working with parents as they take on this co-parenting struggle?
I'll tell you, parenting is difficult enough as it is, as we've discussed. But when you start bringing in two different philosophies, two different sets of experiences, I think one of the things that kind of defines us as parents is how were we parented. And so, if you've got mom and you've got dad, dad's parented one way when growing up, mom's parented another way, and that kind of comes together, that could be a real recipe for disaster. I think opening the lines of communication between mom and dad in terms of, sort of what their values are in terms of parenting, what their expectations are. I think helping them to define what their roles are in certain situations. It's not uncommon and maybe a little stereotypical on my part to say this, but that dads kind of tend to be the heavy. When it comes to discipline, when it comes to enforcing things, and mom's kind of more the nurturer, kind of the, I'm going to make you feel good when you're sick, and so on. To really try to work with the mom and the dad to understand that there's value in both.
Right.
Just because you're a dad doesn't mean you always have to be the heavy. You can be, the healer. You can be the one that they can go to when they're upset.
Right.
And vice versa with mom. It's important that mom has authority in the relationship as well.
There is that balance. There is that balance there, where there has to be some sort of balance.
And it's hard.
I would imagine that the successes come when both parents recognize the fact that, yes, we have our different styles, but if we can come together and kind of like, just kind of like come together and as a whole, we can really experience some sort of success here.
Well, absolutely. And you have those situations. And I hear the stories all the time about how the kids have learned to split mom and dad. And so they'll go specifically and ask one parent, and they know that parent's going to say no. Or the parent's going to say, go ask, your mom, or go ask your dad. And then they come back and say, yeah, they said yes. And the parent's like, okay. Well, no, that's not at all what happened.
Right.
And so it's incumbent on the parents to, hopefully they're communicating well, so that when those things do happen, they can nip it in the bud so the kids aren't splitting.
Do you find that sometimes when you're working with the child, that it's very advantageous to have parent sessions as well? And how beneficial is it? I know it sounds like, oh yes, of course, Tracey, that is beneficial. But have you seen successes in having separate parent sessions? And what is the content usually of those sessions?
I think it's really based in where the parent is at. I use, and a lot of the work I do is based in reducing stress and anxiety. And again, kind of going back to the idea, reducing that stress and anxiety in the parent or the caregiver has a positive impact on the kids. Oftentimes it's validating the struggles that the parents are having.
Right.
So many parents feel like they're the only ones that have to deal with these struggles. Sometimes by just normalizing the struggles, it helps them to realize, wow, I'm not the only one. Kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. They're a little bit more open to different suggestions. But the understanding that a certain technique is not always going to work.
Right.
A certain technique may take 10, 12, 20, 30 times before you find it to be successful.
Right, right.
You know, again, kind of going back to the idea of learning your child and what their tendencies are and what your tendencies are as a parent, and then choosing the correct intervention or the best one that
That's good what you just said. What your tendencies are as a parent. It's know yourself.
It's important.
Understand yourself.
It's very
Be
important.
very self-aware as you're taking care of different situations that arise within the home, within the family home. How does culture have a place in the challenges that parents face today?
Huge. It's absolutely huge. You know, here in the greater Danbury area, we've got a huge contingent of Hispanic families where their countries of origin are outside of the United States.
Right.
And certain practices that they grew up with may or may not be, you know, acceptable in those countries. But they come to find that they come here and they can't do these things. It's frowned upon. It's considered abuse and neglect, and so on and so forth. The challenge is, how do we get the information to them that gives them better techniques that aren't going to be frowned upon? And it really, there just doesn't really seem to be a terrific mechanism at this point in time that gives those folks, you know, different tools that they can use without getting in trouble.
Okay.
It's huge.
So what would you say that they do, you know? Because, yes, there are different cultures, you know, not just Hispanic, but other cultures.
Well, even within the country, you know, within the United
this country,
States.
Even, with the different upbringings.
Absolutely. Generational forms of discipline.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that long ago where kids were, you know, being hit with belts and, you know, told to go pick a switch off the tree and so on and so forth. You know, 30, you know, years ago, those may have been considered acceptable discipline practices. In this day and age, they're not.
Right.
It's abuse and neglect, and you know, it's a consistent way of getting DCF involved, the Department of Children and Families, involved in the lives of children and parents.
Yeah, and that we're talking about the challenges of parenting, and that certainly is a huge challenge there. We have a mother, a father, a caregiver that's doing what they know to do, and all of a sudden they have the authorities knocking on their door, and they're so confused. And you had mentioned that it's a very difficult. This is a very difficult situation. That at times the parent can feel very frustrated. There's not a lot of help out there. But what is the help? What is the solution? There has to be some way, shape, or form for us to be able to help people out here. You know, people have different values, different value systems, different ways of being. What do we do about that? You know, what would you suggest?
I think we need to do better at acknowledging the differences in culture, in experiences, in belief systems, in discipline practices, with the purpose of beginning to have more dialogue around what resources exist that can help people to feel more competent and confident as parents.
Okay.
If those resources don't exist, how do we create them?
Okay.
From my perspective, it's not rocket science. I think sometimes when you get parents together talking about the challenges in a productive and purposeful way, they more times than not have the answers.
Yeah.
When they can relate to other people and connect with other parents who struggle as well, I think there's a different dynamic of support that can potentially be created. You know, with you know, caregivers that are grandparents, the struggles of parenting your grandchild.
Right.
Well, grandma and grandpa want to spoil their grandchild, and
It's a natural thing, yeah.
you know, and let them, you know, go home. We'll see you next time.
Have a good time. Spoil them.
Yeah. But
Let's
then
go do this, that.
they get back into that sort of mindset, or trying to get into that mindset of parenting your grandchild.
Right.
It's like, whoa. And I've heard that many, many times.
Yeah.
Done a lot of work with grandparents
Yeah.
who are raising their grandkids.
It has to be so frustrating, because what happens is that grandma turns into ma, and now your whole perception of how you're going to deal with your grandson, your granddaughter is totally changed.
Absolutely.
Totally changed. Yeah. So you run into that situation as well. Okay. Just really quick. I'm just very mindful of our viewers. I'm very mindful of the different challenges that we face as parents. And is there anything that you can say in the last couple minutes, to parents, grandparents, to young adults that that have children? What are some really foundational base things that you can give to our viewers today, just to kind of lead them in the right path if they are seeking help, whether it's for school issues, for emotional issues, physical. Some children they have special needs. It could be either emotional or physical. What's something that you could leave with our viewers today?
I would say, know your resources. If you see a family member who's struggling,
That's a good one.
get them connected to resources. I mean, by all means, we can be contacted. I can be contacted in my practice if anybody has any questions about kind of a direction that they can maybe go in.
Yes, yes, and we'll make sure that we put your information on the screen, because I know we have a short amount of time. We are going to come back to do part 2, but right now I think that you've done a really good job in giving us an overview of the challenges of parenting and just the different dilemmas that we find ourselves in as parents. So I thank you very much for being here today. I've totally enjoyed speaking with you, Dennis, as always.
Always a pleasure.
And we are going to come back next week. We're going to continue our talk along the lines of wellness and parenting. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in today. It is really important for us to remember that parenting can be stressful. We're going to make sure that you have Dennis's information on the screen, but in the meantime, just know that you're not alone. Get the support that you need from schools and friends, relatives, because parenting is one of the most rewarding jobs and experiences that we can have in our lives. Join me next week for Wellness Today. Take care.